Choi Sang-won, that guy whose name made the toughest dudes in Incheon shake, stood right in the middle of this quiet, echoey big house that felt more like a grave than a cozy spot. In his arms, little Do-hyun was like a ghost, super light and fading, away from the kid he used to be. The kid's pale, see-through skin was pulled tight over ribs that looked like tiny bird bones, and his eyes, once full of spark, were now empty and far away. Sang-won's hands, covered in big tattoos and used to holding power and tough stuff, shook as he held his son against the shiny blue fabric of his fancy suit. On the shiny wood table sat a bowl of fancy soup with gold bits, its steam smelling like a $100 treat. It was made by a top chef from Kyoto, the 70th super famous cook to get called in and then kicked out. With one quick cold move of his hand, Sang-won waved to his guards. The chef got pulled out of the room, yelling for another shot as he went down the stone hall until the big wood door shut off his sounds. The mess-up was total, and in Sang-won's world, messing up was the one bad thing nobody could fix. The quiet, after that, felt like it was choking everyone. Sang-won's big business was the biggest in the land, made from fights, trust, and tons of cash that could get anything but his kids' hunger back. He'd called in 30 top doctors from around the world, and they all left saying the same scary thing. Nothing was wrong with his body. The kid had just stopped wanting to stay alive. The helpers and guards whispered in the dark corners of the big place, their words full of old beliefs. Some said the Choi family was paying back for all the people Sang-won hurt to get to the top. Others said the spirit of the boss's dead wife was pulling her kid to her, hating him in a mean world. Sang didn't buy into spirits, but as he saw the slow, hard up and down of Do-hyun's chest, he felt a deep, scary need. He had it all. Total control, speedy cars, and more money than the town could add up. But it was worthless if he couldn't save. His next in line, he had put up a $10 million prize, a huge amount that pulled in cooks from everywhere. They flew in on fancy planes with rare stuff, but not one got the kid to eat, even a bit. Sang was totally out of ideas. As a cold Incheon rain started hitting the tall windows hard, the boss hugged his son closer, scared that the next breath could be his last. He was the strongest guy in the town, and yet, with his kid starving, he was totally stuck. The rain over, Incheon was a cold, non-stop push that made the sky look like grey rock. At the town's edge, behind metal gates like watchmen, the Choi place stood big, a strong mix of glass and dark rock that felt more like a sad statue than a home. Sharp cameras buzzed as they turned, catching a pic of one person standing in the downpour. She looked like a spirit from another spot. Shiokoi stood by the buzzer, her thin coat stuck to her, and her shoes full of cold water from the path. She was 20 years old, with just a salty backpack, and a heart that wouldn't shut up from the scary show of riches. Under her wet stuff, the edge of an old sewn apron poked out, the only thing she really had. To the guards in the watchroom, with big guns and sharp black suits, she was a mess to look at. They saw her on screens, chuckling as they bet on how long she'd last before the cold one. "Move along." A voice popped through the speaker, buzzy and tired. "This isn't a spot for help." She didn't budge. She got closer to the camera, her face white from cold, but her look strong. "I'm not here for help," she said, her words cutting the storm noise. "I'm here for the boy. I'm here to cook." More laughs came from the room, but soon the gate creaked, opened for a truck, and she snuck in. She walked up the twisty path, past perfect gardens, like in a show spot, until she got to the huge wood doors of the main house. When the top helper opened the door, she saw a puddle of rain and a girl who looked like she'd crossed the sea. The helper's face twisted in quick hate. The entry was like a big church of white stone and gold bits, a spot so clean and perfect that even the air felt pricey. "Out! Get out right now!" the helper snapped, grabbing for Shishi's shoulder to push her back to the rain. "Do you know where you are? This is the house of Chi Sang-won. We don't let poor folks pass the steps." "I saw the AD," she answered, holding steady. Her wet clothes dripped on the stone, an ugly spot on the perfect floor. 70 cooks have tried and left. Your pros and experts failed. If you kick me out now, you're picking to let that little boy die. The helper stopped, her hand in the air, talking. About Duhyun was off limits in the house. A hurt so big no one touched it. Just as the woman started to yell for guards, a heavy step sound came from the big stairs. Chi Sang-gun came down like a dark cloud. He was a guy with scary vibe, his fancy blue suit fitting perfect over shoulders that held a secret world's weight. His neck had ink from his past, and his eyes were dark with tiredness no cash could fix. In his arms, he held a small, quiet wrap in soft blanket. Duhyun was so weak, he hardly pushed his dad's hold. His tiny face sunk in, and his eyes half shut. The workers bowed quick, heads down in fear. Sangwon didn't look at them. He stopped at the stairs' bottom, his eyes on the wet girl in his entry. He saw the ripped bottom of her pants, the cheap coat stuff, and the mud on her shoes. He should have told his guys to get rid of her. He should have felt mad at her being there. But then she looked up. She didn't bow. She didn't shake. She looked straight into the eyes of the scariest guy in Incheon. In that second, Sang saw something he hadn't in the 70 cooks before her. He didn't see want for the $10 million prize. He didn't see the big head from a cooking school or the fear of a worker. He saw a strong, quiet push, a fire that burned like the one he used to run his town. It was the look of someone who knew what they could do. You think you can do what the world's best couldn't? Sang asked, his voice a low, scary shake that seemed to make the floor move. They were cooking for a boss, Shay said, her voice steady. I am cooking for a child. A quick flash of something, maybe respect, or maybe just last hope, went over Sang's face. He looked at his son's pale hand, limp on his chest, and then back at the girl. He got that the fancy stuff and prose had only got him closer to a sad end. Let her in, Sang ordered. The top helper gasped, her face going white. But boss, the floors, she's dirty, I said. Let her in, he said again, the sharp in his voice like it could cut. He turned back to Shishi. The kitchen is yours. But understand this, if you waste my time, if you give my son hope only to fail him, there is no corner of this earth where you can hide from me. She didn't back off. She just fixed her backpack strap and walked past the shocked workers. She headed to the house's back, to the cold, pro kitchen that had turned into a spot of dead fancy food. She didn't need their plans or their gold bits on top. She had the recall of a mum's kitchen, a bag of home spices, and eyes that saw a way to bring a ghost back to life. This steel and shiny big kitchen in the big house felt like a lab for a science that forgot about people. It was a spot of cold tops and quiet, pricey shadows where the air usually smelled of clean stuff and the leftover strong smell of Chong's fancy smokes. As Shishi stepped into the room's middle, the pro-kitchen workers backed to the sides like water pulling away from a new beach. They stood with arms crossed over white tops, their eyes full of laughs and no belief. To them, she was a dirt mark on a clean pick, a girl with mud shoes who dared enter a fancy food spot. Shay didn't look at them. She didn't look at the high-tech stoves or the lines of fancy knives that cost more than her whole town's year crop. Instead, she went to a heavy gas stove at the island's far end, the only one that looked like it could take real firepower. She reached into her backpack, her moves slow and beat-like, and pulled out a heavy iron pot. It was burned at the bottom, dark from years of fire and family, and as she put it on the grate, the sound of metal on metal echoed through the quiet. House like a dare, the change started with one spark. She turned the knob and a ring of blue fire came alive loud, throwing dancing shadows on the shiny stone walls. She grabbed a jar of deep orange palm oil. As she poured it in the pot, the heavy dirt smell started up, thick and yummy, right away fighting the clean air of the place. It was a smell of ground, of sunny dirt and old trees, a smell that didn't belong in a tough guy's strong spot in Incheon. Then came the Scotch bonnets. She cut them with a simple knife, with silver handle from her pocket. the bright red and yellow, outsides open to show seeds with heat from tons of summers. When they hit the hot oil, the air in the kitchen didn't just shift, it blew up. A sharp, spicy cloud of heat went up, a pushy and alive smell that started to sneak through vents and under big wood doors. It pushed away the smell of cold rock and smoke, putting in the big house's sad dark with a smell that was strong, true, and super bold. The kitchen workers started coughing, their eyes watery as the strong spice filled the room. But she didn't back off. She stood over the hot stove, her stand like quiet power. The fire showed in her dark eyes, making her look less like a helper and more like a holy woman doing a special thing. She added onions, the crackle sounding like rain on a metal roof, and then the yummy mix of ginger and garlic that made the air heavy with good stuff. From the door, Chi Sang-won watched quiet. He had switched his fancy coat for a simple vest, his shirt arms up to show the dark, twisty tattoos that told of a guy who lived through tons of fights. He'd seen Thebist cooks do stuff here, moving like robots with plans. But this was different. Chi-Chi moved with smooth, gut-feel grace. Her senses on the oil snap and the rice color change as she mixed it into the bright red base. She wasn't following a book plan. She was following a recall in her blood. The heat in the kitchen went up until the air shook. Chi-Chi's face was shiny with sweat, the stove light making her skin glow like shiny brown. If he stirred the wood spoon, she was making a web of smell that went way past the kitchen walls. Upstairs, in the quiet dark part, where time seemed stopped, the smell got to the room of the starving kid. Dukan was lying in his bed, a ghost in silk sheets, his eyes stuck on a far spot no one else saw. But then the air shifted. The sharp wake-up of the Scotch bonnets and the cozy reach of the palm oil came through his door. It was a smell that didn't ask nice. It was a smell that made you react. For the first time in weeks, the boy's nose moved. His small, pale hand moved on the blanket. It wasn't just food he smelled. It was the smell of warm, safe stuff, a deep recall of a mum he almost forgot, an echo of a trip before he was born. Downstairs, she added the last bits, her moves slowing. As the food got perfect, the red rice was soft and hot, full of pepper fire and spice soul. She put the food not on a gold-edged fancy dish, but on a simple, warm, clay bowl. The quiet in the kitchen was no longer mean. The workers stood stuck, their mouths watery even if they didn't want. Pulled by the draw of the poor girl's cooking, Sangon stepped up, the floor creaking under him. He looked at the bowl, then at the girl who had turned his cold, strong spot into a place of fire and life. The air was no longer full of smoke and end smells. It was alive with home smell. She wiped her face with her hand back and looked up at the boss. She didn't need to say stuff. The fire was out, the meal was ready, and the fight for the boys. Life was about to start. The clay bowl was warm in Shishi's hands, the heat of the fresh jollof rice going through the clay and into her palms. The steam went up like a yummy fog, carrying the sharp, life sting of the Scotch bonnets and the deep dirt rich of the palm oil. She didn't wait for a call. She didn't wait for the top helper to say mean stuff, or for guards to make way. She just turned and started walking, the squish of her damp shoes the only noise in the sudden waiting quiet of the entry. Choi Sang-won followed her, his steps heavy and on purpose. He watched the back of this girl, this new person who brought fire to his cold house, and felt a tight in his chest that wasn't from street fights. He'd spent millions on best dishes and rare stuff, yet he found himself following a girl with a chipped clay bowl and a dirty apron. As they got to the big stairs, the light from crystal lights caught the steam from the rice, making it a shiny gold line that seemed to lead to the dark upper part. They went into Do-hyun's room quiet. The spot was a sea of dark, the only light. From a weak moon glow hidden by inch-on rain, the air here was still, smelling of fancy sheets and the light metal of doctor machines that stood like quiet watchers around the bed. Do-hyun lay in the middle of the big silk sheets, his body so small and weak that he looked less like a boy and more like a thrown-away toy. His eyes were open, staring at a ceiling corner with an empty look that broke Sanguine's tough side every time. She didn't wait. She didn't bow to the boss or ask okay. She walked right to the bed edge and sat, her weight making the pricey bed dip. The top helper at the door sucked in a sharp breath of shock, but one side look from Sanguine shut her up fast. She looked down at the boy. She didn't see the next boss of a bad world or a sick kid needing a wonder. She saw a kid lonely in a way no gold could fix. She blew soft on a spoon of the bright red rice, the steam curling around her fingers. "In my home," she said soft, her voice a low song hum that seemed to push against the clean quiet of the room. "We say that the fire in the pepper is the sun's way of saying hello. It wakes up the heart. It tells the body that it's time to be brave." Duyan's eyes moved slow from the ceiling. His nose moved as the sharp, spicy smell hit him hard. It was a pushy smell, one that didn't fit in this room of quiet talks and soft stuff. It was a smell of life, of heat, and of a world outside these walls. His look landed on the bowl, the deep red of the rice big against the white silk. She held the spoon close to his lips. She didn't beg. She didn't ask. She just waited, her eyes meeting his with steady, quiet, warm. Sanguine stood at the bed's end, his hands tight behind his back so his knuckles went white, his tattoos moving like dark on his skin. He held his breath, the weight of his whole world on one tiny move. Then it happened. Duyan's lips opened. It was a small, unsure move, but to Sanguine, it was like the whole house base moved. The boy took the first bite, and the heat of the ginger and the spice of the peppers hit his tongue, and for a second, Duyan's eyes got big. His small chest jumped. Everyone in the room froze, waiting for him to cough, to pull away, or to throw the bowl, as he had 70 times before. But as the warmth of the palm oil and the rich of the spices went over him, something old and deep in his blood started to wake. It was a taste he didn't know, he recalled. A spicy, cozy echo of a trip his mum took. While he was still safe under her heart, he swallowed. Then he reached out a pale, thin hand and grabbed Shishi's wrist, pulling the spoon back to his mouth. Shishi smiled, a bright, real look that changed her face. She fed him another spoon and then another. The boy, who hadn't eaten in weeks, was eating with sudden, big hunger, his small body leaning into the meal's warmth. The quiet in the room was no longer sad. It was buzzing with wonder power. As Duyan got to the bowl's bottom, a light pink color started in his ghost cheeks. He looked up at Shichi and then slow his lips curved up. It wasn't a fake, nice smile of a boss's kid. It was the shy, bright smile of a kid who finally found home. Sanguine felt a sudden, sharp sting in his eyes. He leaned on the doorframe, the tough outside he'd built for years starting to break. For years, he had lived in a world of dark, of end, and of cold, sure stuff. He had forgotten what it felt like to believe in something he couldn't buy or break. But as he watched his son, his only light, his only why, laughing soft as Shishi wiped a lost rice bit from his chin, the tough boss felt a feeling he thought was gone forever. He felt hope. It was a small, breakable thing, like the flame of Shishi's stove, but it was enough to burn away the dark of the big house. He looked at Shishi, really looked at her, and got that she hadn't just saved his son's life. She had saved his soul. The gold, the power, and the big stuff meant nothing next to the sound of that small, happy breath. In that dark room in Incheon the fire had been lit, and the world would never be cold again. The quiet after Dukan's first full meal was not the heavy, choking quiet of a grave, but the waiting hush of a new day. The boy had gone into a deep, real sleep, his small chest going up and down with a beat that no longer felt like a fight to live. Chi-Chi sat by the bed for a long time, her hands in her lap, watching the color slow come back to his face. Behind her, Chi Sang-won stood like a dark statue, his dark eyes stuck on the empty clay bowl like it was a holy thing. He didn't talk until they were in the hall. the heavy wood door clicking shut with a soft lask sound. Sang turned to She, his big self filling the narrow hall. The flickery light of wall lights played over the dark ink tattoos on his neck, making them look like twisty snakes. For the first time, he didn't look at her with boss, doubt, or the cold of a guy who bought and sold lives. He looked at her with a raw, deep wonder that was almost holy. "What did you put in that rice?" he asked, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I have hired men who can turn gold into soup. I have flown in ingredients that are illegal to export. Why did a bowl of rice and peppers do what they could not?" She wiped a dirt mark from her cheek, her tiredness finally showing. "It isn't magic, Mr. Choi," she replied softly. "It's his memory. Some things are written in the blood before a child is even born. I used palm oil from my village. I used the heat of the Scotch bonnet. It is a taste of home, but not a home he has ever seen with his eyes." Sangwon frowned, the words sparking a dormant memory in the back of his mind. He turned away without a word and began to walk toward the north wing of the mansion, toward a room that had remained locked and untouched for 5 years. Chi-Chi followed him, her heartbeat echoing the heavy thud of his boots on the carpet. He pulled a heavy brass key from his vest and opened the door to his late wife's private study. The air inside was cool and smelled of dried lavender and old paper. Sang didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he lit a single lamp on a mahogany desk piled with journals and leather-bound planners. He began to leaf through them with a frantic energy, his tattooed fingers moving ghost-like over the pages. Finally, he pulled out a small diary with a frayed silk bookmark. He opened it to a section dated 7 years ago. As he read, his face transformed. The hard lines of his jaw softened and his eyes grew distant, flooded with a grief so sharp it seemed to vibrate in the air. He turned the book toward Shishi, pointing to a series of photographs tucked into the back. They were pictures of a beautiful Korean woman with a radiant, adventurous smile. She was standing in a vibrant, sun-drenched market, surrounded by women, in colorful head wraps and stalls overflowing with yams, bright red peppers, and jars of thick orange oil. In the photos, she was visibly pregnant, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "My wife Hannah," Sangwon said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Before Do-Huyen was born, she spent 3 months in West Africa on a business expansion project. That turned into a journey of the soul. She came back, changed. She used to talk about the heat, the red earth, and the food that made her feel alive. She spent weeks trying to recreate the flavors she found in Legos and Abuja, but she could never find the right spices in Seoul. She used to say the baby was moving more when she ate those peppers than at any other time." He looked back at the photos, then at Shishi. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Dukan didn't lose his appetite because he was sick, he whispered. He lost it because he was looking for her. He was looking for the last thing they shared before the world became cold. Shishe reached out, her fingers hovering just above the photograph of the market. "The body remembers what the mind forgets," she said gently. While he was in her womb, he tasted the fire of the Scotch bonnet and the richness of the oil. To him, that isn't African food. It is the taste of his mother's love. It is the only thing that makes him feel like she is still here. Sangwon sank into the leather chair, the weight of his empire finally seeming too heavy for his shoulders. All his power, all his violence, and all his billions had been useless, because he was fighting a ghost. He had tried to nourish his son with status and luxury, when all the boy wanted was a connection to the woman he had lost. He looked at Chi-Chi, seeing her now not as a girl in a tattered apron, but as the bridge between his son and the past. She was the only person in the world who could speak the language of Do-Hyen's hunger. A strange, uncharacteristic warmth spread through the Mafia boss's chest. For 5 years, he had been a man living in a fortress of ice. But tonight, the fire Shishi had lit in the kitchen had finally reached his heart. "You didn't just feed him, Chi-Chi," Sangin said, looking up at her with a look of profound, humbled gratitude. "You brought her back to us." The Enchon rain continued to drum against the windows, but inside the room, the shadows seemed less imposing. The secret was out. The mystery of the starving heir was solved, not by medicine, but by the enduring power of a mother's memory, carried across an ocean in the simple spices of a girl who had dared to knock on a monster's door. The morning sun that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Incheon estate seemed to carry a new kind of light, one that didn't just illuminate the cold marble, but seemed to warm it. The mansion, once a tomb of silence and shadows, was now echoing with sounds that the guards and maids found profoundly unsettling, yet strangely magnetic. It was the sound of a child's laughter, thin and delicate as glass, but unmistakably real. She did not stay confined to the kitchen. With the silent, watchful permission of Chi Sangwon, she moved through the house like a soft breeze, carrying Du Hyun in her wake. She didn't treat him like a fragile patient or a prince to be feared. She treated him like a younger brother who had been away from the sun for too long. In the sun-drenched breakfast nook, she replaced the heavy silver cutlery with colorful, wooden bowls she had brought in her pack, and she began the work of feeding not just his body, but his mind. "Kidu," she would ask, her voice a low, rhythmic melody, as she sat him on a stool next to her while she prepped vegetables. When the boy looked at her with wide, curious eyes, she would tap her chest. "It means, how are you in my language, Igbo? Can you say it?" "Kudu." Dahyun's first attempt was a tiny breathy whisper. "Kudu." Shishi's face lit up with a grin so bright, it made the headmaid who was polishing silver nearby pause in mid. "Oima. That means it is good. You are a natural, Dukun. You have the soul of a traveler." As the days passed, the cultural landscape of the mansion began to shift. Chi-Chi began to play music from her phone, high-life rhythms, and Afrobeat tracks that pulsed with a heartbeat the stone walls had never felt. At first, the guards stood stiffly, their hands on their holstered weapons, confused by the vibrant syncopation. But slowly, the tension in their shoulders began to drop. The house was no longer a place where men only waited for orders of violence. It was a place where a small boy was learning to count in a tongue from across the sea. Otu, Abuato Duhyeon, would recite his small fingers following Shichi as they counted out plantain slices. She brought color into the gray. One afternoon, she produced a length of vibrant Ankara fabric, a swirl of deep indigo and sun yellow, and draped it over the back of the clinical leather sofa in the library. She told Du Hyun stories of the red dust of Legagos, of the giant baobab trees that held the secrets of ancestors, and of markets so loud and joyful they could be heard from the heavens. She taught him that his mother hadn't just visited a place. She had fallen in love with the spirit of resilience, and that same spirit was now part of him. Ki-Sangan watched these transformations from the shadows of the hallways, a ghost haunting his own reviving home. He saw his son, who used to flinch at the sound of a raised voice, now reaching out to touch the rough texture of the fabrics Chi-Chi wore. He saw the boy's eyes, once hollow and fixed on the ceiling, now sparkling with the effort of learning new words. Dalu Duhyeon said one evening, as his father entered the room, the Igbo word for thank you, sounding like a prayer in the quiet air. Sang felt a strange, tightening ache in his chest. He was a man who understood power in the form of fear and debt. But the power she wielded was something else entirely. She was the unlikely matriarch, a girl with no title and no weapons, who had staged a bloodless coup against the grief that had ruled his house. She was teaching his son to be brave, to be curious, and to find joy in a world that had previously only offered him gold and shadows. The staff, once mocking and cold, began to follow her lead. The younger maids started asking Chi-Chi about the spices she used, drawn in by the warmth she radiated. Even the most hardened guards would linger a moment longer near the sunroom, listening to the stories of the tortoise and the wisdom of the elders. The mansion was no longer a fortress protecting a dying heir. It was becoming a home. But as the laughter grew louder and the colors grew brighter, Sangwon knew that the world outside, the world of blood, tradition, and rivalries, was watching. For now, however, he allowed himself the luxury of watching she lean over his son, her dark hand over his small, pale one, as they traced the shape of a world that was no longer divided by oceans. The piece within the mansion walls was a fragile glass sculpture, beautiful and clear, but the world outside was already thrown. Stones Wachishi taught Duyan the songs of her ancestors. The shadow of the Incheon underworld was lengthening. It began with the telephoto lenses of paparazzi perched on the hillsides, capturing blurred images of a black woman in a vibrant apron playing in the garden with the heir to the Choi Empire. Then came the headlines. The tabloids in digital news cycles were merciless, fueled by a mixture of shock and deep-seated prejudice. The Dragon of Incheon's secret African maid, one headline screamed, while others questioned if the most powerful man in the city had lost his mind or his strength. Inside the house, she felt the shift before she saw it. The guards grew tenser, their hands never straying far from their weapons, and the headmaid's lingering resentment found new life in the cruel comments she accidentally let she overhear. She found a discarded newspaper in the kitchen, the ink staining her fingers as she read the xenophobic vitriol directed at her. She looked at the photo of herself in Duhyeon, a moment of pure joy captured and twisted into a scandal. For a moment, her resolve wavered. She wasn't a soldier, she was a cook who had only wanted to save a child. She began to wonder if her presence was doing more harm than good to the man who had given her a chance. Cho Sanang saw the newspaper on the counter that evening. He didn't say a word, but the air around him seemed to drop tense. His business partners were calling, their voices thick with thinly veiled mockery. They saw his domestic happiness as a leak in his armor. To them, a mafia boss who spent his evenings learning the names of African spices was a man who had grown soft. They didn't understand that for the first time in his life, Sangan had something worth fighting for that wasn't made of cold stone or blood-soaked cash. The confrontation came on a Thursday night during the monthly summit of the 5 ruling families of Incheon, usually held in a high-end, traditional Korean restaurant. Sang had insisted on hosting it at his estate. He wanted them to see the truth. The other bosses arrived with their entourages, men with scarred faces and cold eyes, who looked at the colorful and Kura fabrics draped in the foyer with open derision. Leading the descent was Lee Kongdae, an older traditionalist boss who had long coveted Sangwin's territory. During dinner, as the staff served a fusion of Korean and Nigerian small plates that Chi-Chi had meticulously prepared, Kungd pushed his plate away with a theatrical sigh. "We came here to discuss the expansion of the port Sangan, not to be fed the scraps of a foreign kitchen." Kongdae sneered, his voice carrying across the silent table. "The streets are laughing. They say the dragon has been tamed by a girl who doesn't even know her place. They say you've traded your fire for palm oil." The room went deathly silent. Sangwin's guards moved instinctively. Bath held up a tattooed hand. Stopping them, he leaned forward, the light of the chandelier glinting off the dark ink on his neck. "The girl you speak of did what 70 of your traditional experts could not," Sangan said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "She brought my son back from the grave. If you find her food beneath you, Kongdae, perhaps it's because your palate has grown as stale as your loyalty." Kongdae stood up, his chair screeching against the marble. "You bring a poor foreigner into this house and expect us to treat her like a queen. You've grown weak, Choi. You're distracted by a maid, and a weak leader is a liability to us all." Just then, she entered the room to clear the plates. She had heard the raised voices, the mockery in their tone. She stood tall, her apron tied tight, her eyes meeting Kongdae's with the same unflinching fire she had used to face the stove. Kongdae reached out, intending to shove her aside as a show of dominance, but he never got the chance. In a blur of motion, Sangwin was on his feet. He caught Kong's wrist in a grip that sounded like dry wood snapping. The sheer violence of the movement sent a clear message. The dragon had not been tamed. He had found a new reason to burn. "She is not a maid," Sang hissed into Kang, his eyes twin voids of darkness. "She is the heart of this house." And if you ever lay a hand on her or breathe another word of disrespect toward her, I will personally ensure you never eat another meal again." He flung Kongdae's hand back. The other bosses watched in stunned silence as the older man stumbled, his face turning a shade of purple. Sang turned to Chi-Chi, his expression softening for just a fraction of a second, a silent apology for the world he had brought her into. "The dinner's over," Sang announced, his voice echoing through the mansion. "Get out, all of you, and tell the streets this. The Dragon of Incheon doesn't care about your judgment. I have found my strength in the fire of this kitchen, and I will burn anyone who tries to extinguish it." As the rivals retreated into the rainy night, she stood in the empty dining room, the adrenaline finally fading into a cold shiver. Sang walked over to her, his heavy presence both terrifying and deeply comforting. He didn't apologize again. In his world, protection was the only apology that mattered. But as he looked at her, she realized that the war wasn't just about his son anymore. It was about them. The underworld had passed its judgment, but Cho Sang-gon had delivered his verdict. They were no longer just a boss and a cook. They were a family under siege. And the fire Chi-Chi had lit was now the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The echoes of the confrontation in the dining hall lingered in the mansion's long marble corridors, like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet Chi-Chi had worked so hard to cultivate, but a heavy, watchful stillness. In the small guest room she had come to call her own, Chi-Chi sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she looked at the vibrant Ankara fabric she had draped over the chair only days before. The headlines she had seen, the mockery she had heard, and the raw violence she had witnessed in Sangwon's eyes tonight coalesced into a single, terrifying realization. Her presence was no longer just a cure. It was a catalyst for war. She began to pack. Her movements were slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the fire she had displayed in the kitchen. She folded her warm clothes and tucked her small jars of spices back into the backpack she had carried through the rain on that first Tuesday. She felt like an interloper who had accidentally stepped into the gears of a massive, dangerous machine. She loved Du Hyeon with a fierce maternal protectiveness, and she had seen a side of Cho Sang that the world insisted didn't exist. But she couldn't ignore the target she had painted on their backs. If her leaving meant the dragon could return to his cold, untouchable throne without the weight of a foreign scandal, then she had to go. As she reached for the blue and yellow fabric on the chair, the door to her room creaked open. She expected to see Sang-won, his dark eyes filled with either fury or silent understanding. Instead, she saw a small, pale figure standing in the doorway. Dukon was dressed in his favorite pajamas, the ones Chi-Chi had picked out because they were the color of the Nigerian sky at dusk. He looked at the open backpack on the bed and the light in his eyes. The light Chi-Chi had fought so hard to relight flickered and died. "Chi-Chi," he whispered, his voice small and brittle in the vastness of the room. She felt a sharp physical pain in her chest. She knelt down so she was eye level with him, trying to keep her expression steady. "Da-hyun, it's late. You should be sleeping." The boy didn't move. He pointed a trembling finger at the bag. "You're putting the spices away. Why are you putting the fire away?" "Sometimes," she began, her voice thick with unshed tears. "People like me are like the Scotch bonnets I use. We bring a lot of heat, but if there's too much of it, we'd burn the people we care about. Your father is a powerful man, but the people outside, they're being mean because I am here. If I stay, they will keep trying to hurt this house." Dukan stepped into the room, his small feet silent on the carpet. He didn't cry. Instead, he looked at her with a profound, ancient sadness that reminded her of the ghost he had been when she first arrived. He reached out and gripped the sleeve of her tattered jacket, his knuckles turning white with the effort. "I was a ghost," he said, the words coming out in a rush of broken Korean and the Igbo words she had taught him. "Before the galof rice, before the stories of the tortoise, I was waiting to go to where a mama is. The doctors gave me medicine that tasted like metal. The chefs gave me gold that tasted like nothing. But you gave me your heart, Che, you gave me Odema. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. If you go, the cold will come back. The shadows will come back. I don't care about the people outside. I don't care if they laugh. Please do not leave me in the dark again, Delu. Please stay. She pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his hair. She could feel his heart beating against her own, a strong, steady rhythm that she had helped build. In that moment, the logic of the underworld and the fear of the media felt insignificant compared to the weight of the boy in her arms. She realized that leaving wouldn't protect him. It would only empty him out again. She was no longer just a cook. She was the anchor keeping his soul from drifting away. Her shadow fell across the doorway, and she looked up to see Changangwen standing there. He had discarded his vest, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, to reveal the dark ink of the dragon on his chest. He looked at the backpack, then at his son, clinging to the girl from Lagos. He didn't move to pull them apart. He didn't offer her money to stay, or threats if she left. The world thinks I am weak because I let you in, Sangwen said, his voice a low resonant rumble. They think I have traded my teeth for a home. But they don't understand that for the first time in 5 years, I have something I would burn the entire city to protect. You think you are a burden, Chi-Chi, but to us, you are the only thing that is real. He stepped into the room and placed a heavy, tattooed hand on Du-Hyen's shoulder, but his eyes remained fixed on Shi. If you walk out that gate, you are leaving your family behind, and a Choi never abandons family. Stay. Let them scream. Let them mock. I will be the shield and you will be the fire. That is the only deal I am interested in making. She looked from the powerful man to the small boy, then back to the backpack. Slowly, she reached out and tipped the bag over, letting her few belongings spill back onto the bed. She picked up the anchor fabric and draped it back over the chair, the vibrant colors defiant against the mansion's gray stone. I'm staying, she whispered. Du-Hyen let out a long, shaky sigh of relief and squeezed her tighter. Sang didn't smile. It wasn't in his nature, but the predatory tension in his jaw relaxed, replaced by a quiet, ironclad resolve. The war with the outside world was far from over, and the judgment of the underworld would only grow louder. But inside that room, the choice had been made. The girl with the apron wasn't going anywhere, and the Dragon of Incheon finally had a reason to fight. That was worth more than gold. The grand hall of the Incheon Maritime Club was a palace of cold glass and polished obsidian, a place where the city's legitimate elite rubbed shoulders with its most dangerous shadows. On this night, the air was thick with the scent of vintage, cognac and the unspoken tension of a brewing coup. Every major player in the underworld was present, their eyes darting toward the empty head table where the seat of the dragon waited. The rumors had reached a fever pitch. The streets were whispering that Cho Sang-wan had finally traded his steel for a wooden spoon, and that his empire was ripe for the taking. When the heavy gilded doors finally swung open, a collective hush fell over the room, so sudden and absolute, that the clinking of crystal seemed to echo like breaking ice. Cho Sang-wan did not enter alone, nor did he enter with an army of soldiers at his back. He walked with a steady, predatory grace, his hand firmly interlaced with Chi-Chi. She was a vision of defiant beauty, a living bridge between two worlds. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that hugged her frame, but draped over her shoulder was a sash of her finest encore fabric, a bold explosion of gold and crimson that stood out against the monochrome sea of black suits like a wildfire in a desert. Beside them, holding Shi's other hand, was Du-Hyen. The boy was no longer the fading ghost of a child. His cheeks were full, his eyes were bright with a newfound curiosity, and he walked with a pride that mirrored his father's. The whispers began almost immediately, a low, poisonous hum that vibrated through the ballroom. There she is, they hissed. The foreign maid, the scandal of Incheon. Sang-wan ignored them, leading Shi and Du-Hyen to the center of the raised ease. He didn't sit. He stood at the microphone, his dark eyes scanning the room, until the murmurs died in the throats of the men who uttered them. Standing at the front of the crowd was Lee Kongdae, his face a mask of smug satisfaction, flanked by the other 4 ruling families. He looked ready to deliver a eulogy for Sangwon's reputation. For 20 years, I have sat at this table, Sangwon began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried to every corner of the hall. I have built an empire on the strength of my name and the sharpness of my blade. You all came here tonight expecting to see a man who has grown weak. You came here to see if the rumors were true, that I have been tamed by the fire of a kitchen. He paused, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on Shishi's. You were right about one thing. I have changed. I spent 5 years protecting a throne that felt like a tomb. I protected a legacy that was starving my only son to death. I lived in the dark because I thought that was the only way to rule. He turned to Chi-Chi, his expression softening in a way that shocked the hardened men below. Then this woman walked through my gates. She didn't bring weapons, and she didn't bring a title. She brought a flame that was older and stronger than any war I've ever fought. She fed my son when the world had given him up for dead. She brought life back into a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Lee Kongdae stepped forward, his voice dripping with venom. A touching story, Sangwon, but a dragon cannot rule with a maid by his side. You are choosing a scandal over your duty. You are choosing a foreigner over your people. If you do this, you forfeit the throne. Sang looked at Kong, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face, the smile of a man who had already won. You think the throne is the prize, Kong? You think this crown of thorns is what makes a man powerful? In a move that shattered every tradition of the Incheon underworld, Sangan reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, a simple, elegant band of gold set with a rare sun-colored diamond that matched the patterns in Shi's fabric. He dropped to one knee in front of her, right there in front of the men who wanted him dead, and the media that wanted to tear her apart. Chichiyukwai, he said, his voice steady and clear, reaching past the dangerous men to the woman who had saved his soul. I do not offer you a throne of blood. I'll offer you a home. I offer you a life where we build something new together, a legacy that bridges our worlds and honors the fire you brought into my life. I am choosing my family. I am choosing you. Will you be my wife? Will you be the mother of the Choi line? Not by blood, but by love. The room went completely silent. It was a declaration of war against the old ways, a public decree that the dragon was no longer interested in the throne if it meant losing his heart. She looked down at him, her eyes shimmering with tears, but her posture remained as regal as any queen. She looked at Du Hien, who was clapping his small hands in silent encouragement, and then back at the man who had been a monster to the world, but a protector to her. Yes, she whispered, her voice carrying through the silence like a song. Oim. Yes. As Sang slipped the ring onto her finger and stood up to kiss her, a few of the younger associates began to applaud, moved by a story that transcended their violent reality. But for the rival bosses, the message was clear. Cho Sangan hadn't grown weak. He had found a reason to be invincible. He had chosen his family over the crown, and in doing so, he had become the most powerful man Incheon had ever seen. The old world was dying, but in the heat of Shishi's fire, a new one was being born. The transformation of the Choi Empire did not happen overnight, but it began with the same fierce intentionality that Choi Sangwon had once used to rule the streets of Incheon. The transition from the underworld to the world of global commerce was a journey paved with the scent of Scotch bonnets and the rich golden hue of imported palm oil. Sangwon had spent a lifetime controlling the city's ports for shadow cargo, but now those same shipping lanes were filled with the vibrant colors of West African spices hand-selected by Shichi and her family in Lagos. He had traded his title of dragon for the role of a mogul, a man who realized that the most sustainable power was not built on blood, but on the soul of a home. In the heart of Seoul's most prestigious district, a new kind of landmark arose, Odima Fusion. The building was a masterpiece of architectural harmony, blending the minimalist, sharp lines of modern Korean design with the warm, earthy textures of Nigerian craftsmanship. On its opening night, the line of people stretched around the block, not out of fear or obligation, but out of a desperate curiosity to taste the food that had famously healed the heir to the Choi fortune. Inside the air was a thick, intoxicating symphony of ginger, garlic, and pillar leaves. A sensory proof that two worlds, once thought to be irreconcilable, could create something beautiful together. Chi-Chi stood at the center of the kitchen, no longer the rain-drenched girl in a tattered jacket, but a culinary visionary in a custom-tailored apron that bore the family's new crest. She moved with the same quiet strength she had possessed since her first day at the stove, her dark hands moving with practiced grace as she showed her team how to balance the heat of the Nigerian peppers with the delicate sweetness of cayenne. She wasn't just a chef, she was the matriarch of a legitimate dynasty. Beside her, Duhian often stood on a small wooden stool, his eyes bright with health and excitement as he helped her stir the heavy iron pots. He was no longer the silent, starving ghost. He was a boy who spoke 3 languages fluently and knew the names of every spice in the pantry. The social prejudice that had once threatened to tear them apart had withered in the face of their undeniable success. The same business partners who had mocked Sanglan's foreign cook now begged for reservations at the head table. The media, once so cruel and xenophobic, now hailed him as the ultimate symbol of a modern multicultural Korea. Sang watched this shift with a quiet, ironical smile. He knew the world hadn't changed, but he had. He no longer needed to intimidate his rivals because he had surpassed them in a way they couldn't comprehend. He was a man who went home every night to a house filled with music, laughter, and the lingering warmth of a shared meal. 10 years after that rainy Tuesday morning, the family celebrated their anniversary in the garden of the mansion. The estate was no longer a fortress. The iron gates were often open, and the cold marble had been softened by the presence of 2 more children, a daughter with Sanguin's piercing eyes, and a son with Shishi's radiant smile. They played in the grass, their laughter echoing the same joy that had first broken the mansion's silence a decade ago. Sangwin stood on the terrace, his hand resting on Shishi's shoulder as they watched their children. The dark ink on his neck was still there, a reminder of the man he used to be, but it was now a map of a past that no longer defined his future. The legacy they built was more than a business. It was a testament to the fact that the most unexpected love stories are often the most powerful. Duhian eventually followed in Shishi's footsteps, becoming a world-renowned chef in his own right, dedicated to writing cookbooks that explored the healing power of comfort food. He never forgot the taste of that first bowl of jollof rice, the meal that had called him back from the edge of the dark. The lesson of their lives remained simple, yet profound. Love and home cooking had conquered a world of fear. They proved that no matter how deep the grief or how wide the cultural divide, a seat at the table and a shared bowl of food could mend a broken soul. As the sun set over Inchin, casting a golden light over the Choi estate, the air was no longer thick with the scent of cigars and secrets. It was alive with the smell of spices, the warmth of a fire that would never go out, and the quiet, enduring peace of a family that had finally found its way home.